Good day. Today's lecture is devoted to the forms of training organization that rely on active methods in university teaching. This topic is especially important because higher education is expected not only to transmit knowledge, but also to cultivate independence, analytical capacity, and purposeful participation in academic work. Accordingly, the organization of instruction should be viewed not as a formal framework, but as a pedagogical condition that directly influences the quality of learning. In this respect, active methods deserve special attention, since they transform the student from a passive recipient into an active participant in the educational process. This slide presents the triad of educational goals achieved through active learning. As the diagram on page 2 shows, effective active pedagogy arises at the intersection of control, engagement, and monitoring. To begin with, control refers to the teacher's guiding influence over the learning process. However, such control should not be interpreted as rigid domination. Rather, it provides coherence, direction, and pedagogical purpose. At the same time, engagement ensures the active participation of both prepared and less prepared students in academic work. Consequently, learning becomes more inclusive and more balanced. Equally important is monitoring, since active instruction requires continuous observation of student progress and timely adjustment of teaching. Therefore, the value of active pedagogy lies precisely in this combination: structured guidance, broad participation, and ongoing pedagogical regulation. The present slide develops the previous idea by moving, as the title suggests, beyond the podium. In other words, active learning in higher education requires a reconsideration of the teacher's role. The university lecturer is no longer merely a source of information. Instead, the lecturer becomes an organizer of cognitive activity. The page 3 diagram identifies 3 core pillars of active learning. First, cognitive activation means that students acquire knowledge through thought and practice rather than through mechanical reproduction. Second, universal participation ensures that all students are involved in academic work, not only the most confident or most prepared. Third, continuous monitoring allows the teacher to maintain a constant feedback loop throughout the learning process. Thus, active learning combines intellectual independence with pedagogical guidance. The diagram on page 4 presents learning as a 3-stage process. The first stage is initial knowledge acquisition, where the student first encounters new material through such forms as problematic lectures and heuristic conversations. The second stage is knowledge control and anchoring, where collective intellectual work and assessment are used to ensure that the material has been understood and retained. The third stage is skills formation and creativity. At this point, knowledge is converted into professional skill through simulated training, games, and creative problem solving. Consequently, the logic of active learning moves from encounter to consolidation to application. This sequence is pedagogically important because it respects the internal development of understanding rather than treating all forms of learning as identical. The taxonomy on page 5 classifies active methods into imitation forms and non-imitation forms. This distinction is methodologically useful because it clarifies that active learning can proceed either through model situations or through intensified academic interaction without explicit simulation. The slide also lists 4 broad organizational forms: lectures, seminars, discussions, and collective thought activity. Therefore, active learning is not limited to one format. On the contrary, it may be embedded in several established university forms, provided that these forms are structured in such a way as to stimulate inquiry, dialogue, and intellectual initiative. Page 6 identifies several innovative lecture formats within non-simulation active learning. These include the problematic lecture, the visualization lecture, the 2-person lecture, the lecture with planned errors, and the press conference lecture. Each of these formats introduces activity into the lecture in a different way. The problematic lecture begins with a question and requires reflection. The visualization lecture translates complex material into visual form. The 2-person lecture exposes students to differing viewpoints. The lecture with planned errors forces them to identify and analyze inaccuracies in real time. Finally, the press conference lecture turns student questions into the organizing principle of the session. Accordingly, the lecture remains a university form, yet it is transformed from passive exposition into active intellectual work. This slide, shown on page 7, turns to collaborative and discussion-based methods. The roundtable method is presented as a collective discussion format that enables students to apply theory under simulated research conditions. Training discussions, meanwhile, may arise from previous lectures, practical results, current press publications, or field-specific events. The slide also outlines several seminar types within the roundtable framework: interdisciplinary, problem-based, thematic, orientational, and systematic seminars. Each type serves a distinct pedagogical purpose. Hence, discussion in higher education should not be regarded as informal conversation. Rather, it is a structured academic method through which argumentation, perspective-taking, and conceptual depth are developed. The next diagram on page 8 invites us to rethink the university lecture itself. The central statement is especially important. The problematic lecture begins with questions, not answers. This means that reflection precedes explanation, and intellectual inquiry becomes the path to understanding. The diagram further identifies 3 outcomes of the complete active lecture: assimilation, development, and formation. Assimilation concerns the mastery of theoretical knowledge. Development refers to the growth of theoretical thinking. Formation, finally, concerns the emergence of cognitive interest and professional motivation. Thus, the lecture is no longer reduced to information transfer. Instead, it becomes a form that informs, develops, and shapes the future specialist. Page 9 presents the logic of educational discussion as a structured mechanism. Discussion may be initiated by lecture materials, practical training results, student-suggested problems, field practice events, or press publications. These inputs then feed into active educational discussion, which produces several important outcomes. Among these outcomes are strengthened knowledge, an increased volume of new information, developed argumentation and proof skills, and the ability to listen to other viewpoints. Therefore, educational discussion performs several pedagogical functions simultaneously. It consolidates knowledge, expands thought, disciplines reasoning, and cultivates academic listening. In this regard, discussion becomes one of the most productive forms of university-level active learning. The synthesis diagram on page 10 maps active methods onto a semester timeline. The sequence begins with phase 1, initial acquisition, which includes the problematic lecture and the problem-based seminar. It then proceeds to phase 2, anchoring, where lecture visualization and the interdisciplinary seminar strengthen and systematize knowledge. After that comes phase 3, skill formation, represented by the planned error lecture and the student-suggested discussion. Finally, the review phase culminates in the press conference lecture, which integrates results and provides transition. Consequently, the active module is not a collection of isolated methods. Rather, it is a deliberately organized pedagogical sequence in which each method corresponds to a particular stage of cognitive demand. Thank you for your attention. I hope this lecture has clarified the pedagogical logic of organizing university training through active methods and has shown how lectures, seminars, and discussions may be transformed into more participatory and intellectually productive forms.